Chapter 2. To Stay or to Go. Location: Fort Brooke, Necropolian Continent. Date: AE 17. The journey had taken over a day, and judging by the direction, both Solara and I knew where Fears was taking us long before we ever arrived. A great river bisected the continent, and was only passable along narrow bends. At each of these bends there existed forts with large bridges. The forts changed hands between Alathian and Anaran forces often enough that I was surprised that they ever managed to clean away all of the blood before the next battle. Previously, I'd never had much reason to visit the forts, the only news of them reaching us by way of passing tradesmen. Fort Brooke was the closest of these, and the southernmost bridge on the continent. We approached cautiously from the tree line that had been cleared in front of the walls, with Fears loudly proclaiming who we were, as to not attract arrows from the defenders. The fort, all things considered, was less than impressive. The stone walls stood at near around 15 to 20 feet at the very highest, and sections of the wall looked as though they were one aggressive breeze away from falling over. Gray banners hung over the walls in places, with the Alathian symbol drawn in dark blue. The symbol was a cross potent, but with short lines leading from the crutches towards the center of the cross, where the outline of a circle surrounded the place where the center lines crossed. The portcullis in front of the wooden gate looked sturdy enough, and we waited patiently as it was raised and the large doors were pulled open. "Be taking you to see the captain first," Fears commented as we began to walk through the gates. "I want to meet you and give you some part of an idea of what we're up against." "Lead the way," I said with an exaggerated gesture inwards as Solara and I fell in behind him. The inside of the courtyard wasn't any more or less impressive than the outside had been. It was a simple circle of mostly muddy ground that was constantly bombarded by the rain from the light clouds above. Military supplies were in crates covered in tarps labeled as food, weaponry, other necessities. 20 or so people moved about in the courtyard, all dressed in Alathian grays and blues, wearing various amounts of armor and all covered by thick gray cloaks. None of them bothered to stop to look at us as we entered. Apparently their duties were too important, and they were too disciplined to let newcomers interrupt their tasks. "This way," Fears called as he gestured the two of us through a doorway that was built into one of the walls. I shrugged to Solara and entered first, immediately stunned by the warm air that greeted me. A man stood on the other side of the table, covered by a giant map strewn with various figures that presumably represented friendly and enemy forces and positions. He had glanced up at us for the briefest of seconds as we'd entered, but had continued scrawling on the map as he spoke under his breath, too quietly for me to make out the words. The room wasn't much in the way of decorations, save for an Alathian standard strewn across one of the walls. A wooden door was positioned to the left and right of the entrance, and I assumed it led to other rooms within the walls. It took me far longer than I was comfortable with to notice Aline lazily perched atop a crate towards the left rear of the room, observing me with her intense gaze. "Have the two of you ever seen the bridge?" the man asked, without looking up, in an accent that I had heard called Germanic. "Oh, not this question again," Aline whispered from her position before she jumped lithely down and joined the man by his map. She was only a few inches shorter than him, putting the man at least 6 foot. "I must have some fun, otherwise I will wake up in the morning and see you in the mirror instead of myself. Now I ask again, have either of you ever seen the bridge?" I glanced at Solara, who only shook her head before she answered him. "No, sir, we haven't." "And that is where you are wrong. For you see, the fort is the bridge. The dirt and mud outside merely covers the structure beneath. The river flows directly beneath our feet. It's quite the marvel of engineering," he said as he finally looked up from his map to face us. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, some of the lines of age showing, but very few. His straight blonde hair was cut in a shorter style, and his strong jawline and high cheekbones were only sparsely covered by a half-day's worth of blonde stubble. His light brown eyes stared at us hawkishly from over his sharp but not overly large nose. "I would apologize for my lack of attention, but as you may well guess, there's much to be done and little time to do it in. As such, I will cut directly to the point, beginning with introductions. I am Captain Klaus Meinhardt. The remaining soldiers you see here are under my command," he said brusquely and ended with a nod. "Caden and Solara von Metz. Good to meet you. I responded, matching his no-nonsense attitude. Laughlin, isn't there something productive somewhere you should be doing? Captain Meinhardt asked as he looked around us to Fears, who was still standing in the doorway. Oh, Fears responded sheepishly. Aye, sir. Then you'd best be about doing it, Captain Meinhardt said with a pointed nod as Fears left with a salute and closed the door behind him. Now, where were we? He hesitated as he came around his table before leaning back against it with his arms crossed lightly over his chest, concealing his gray tabard with the Alathian insignia emblazoned blue on the thick fabric. Ah, yes, he continued. Why you are here? The two of us kept quiet, sensing that it wasn't a question, but rather an opportunity for him to think through his next words before continuing. He didn't disappoint. What do you know of Alathian and Nara? Meinhardt asked as he placed a hand on his chin. The short version. They are the two primary powers on the continent and have been at war for as long as anyone remembers, I began, doing my best to summarize. Yes and no, Meinhardt answered. They are not just the primary powers on this continent, they are the primary powers in this world, and far beyond. We have been at war for far longer than the oldest histories can remember. What do you mean beyond this world? I asked, cocking my head to the side in confusion, seeing that Solara didn't appear to know anything more than I did. What have you heard of the Elysians? Captain Meinhardt followed up, completely ignoring my previous question. For curiosity's sake, I decided to drop the former issue and answer the question. The impression I had of the man told me that he was asking the questions for a reason, not just ignoring me out of disregard. Powerful warriors that fight along the Alathian and Naran armies? I've heard stories of them winning unwinnable battles. I've heard a claim that some have come back to life after dying in battle, I answered, recalling what I'd heard over the years. And how much of it have you believed? Meinhardt asked with a smile. Very little, I answered honestly. Great battles make for great legends. Some people are born with more talent in battle than others. Some have done nothing but train their entire lives. They would be impressive, yes, but there's nothing mythical about an outstanding warrior. Common sentiment, shared by the more intelligent, but ill-informed, Meinhardt answered smoothly as he lowered his hand to the table behind him. Ill-informed? Solara asked as I chewed on the captain's words. I am at this point over 700 years old, Meinhardt responded coolly, looking us each directly in the eye in turn. No offense, Captain, I responded with a wry smile. I'd believe that you look good for your late 40s, but 700 is a bit of a stretch. 46, this time around, Meinhardt answered with a slight laugh. Further than I've usually made it. You're not making any sense, I responded slowly as I searched the man's face for the lie. I concluded that either he was insane or there was some truth to what he was saying because he appeared to believe every word. There is much and more that you don't understand about your world, Caden von Metz, he answered as he leaned forward to stand and began walking back around the other side of the table. Your partner there knows more than she lets on, he finished with a slight wink in Solara's direction. I looked to Solara, but she only reached up to squeeze my arm comfortingly, as if to say, later, as she kept her gaze fixed on the captain. What now, Captain? Solara asked. The lieutenant didn't send the Laughlin back for us just so you could tell us about a bridge and share some interesting stories. Straight to the heart of the matter, Meinhardt exclaimed as he tapped both of his hands against the map. I believe I will like the two of you, he said with a smile to himself. Arthus? Meinhardt said with a small gesture to Aline, whom I had forgotten was even there. Explain, he finished as he went back to work on his map. Elysians, Aline began in her smooth tone, are exceptionally rare and can only be recruited from the human population. All other mysticisms aside, except that it takes a special kind of person to be selected for consideration to join the Elysian ranks. Only 4 in 10 potential recruits makes it through selection, and even fewer survive their first transition. Lieutenant Altus here is one of those potential candidates, Captain Meinhardt put in absent-mindedly from his place behind the table, along with the rest of her detachment. She has put in for your consideration, but only an Elysian can approve candidates. And do you? Solara asked, driving straight to the point as I was still realizing what Captain Klaus Meinhardt was. He stopped writing to look up at Solara and I with a small smile. Yes, he said with a small nod as the smile faded away, leaving him looking terribly tired for some reason. "Lieutenant Althus, please show them to their quarters and room them together. They can begin tomorrow, if they are still here tomorrow." "Why wouldn't we be?" I asked as Aline began to usher us towards the door. "Because," the captain began as he looked up at us, and I saw the many years of blood and death behind his eyes, "it is my most earnest advice that you should leave tonight and never look back." The quarters weren't spacious. It was, however, a roof over our heads, and we couldn't well argue with that, even if I was sure we'd be leaving in the morning. The bed wasn't large by any means, but on a cold night in a stone room, I doubted we'd want much space between us. "Caden," Solara began as soon as we'd lit a candle and closed the door behind us. "I can explain," she said in an almost urgent tone while she turned to face me. "Explain what?" I asked, arching an eyebrow in confusion. "About what the captain said back there," she said as she looked away. "I do know more than I've told you." "Was this from your life before you came to Metz?" I asked, taking a step closer to her. "What?" she asked as she looked up and then away again. Yes." "Then it doesn't matter." How can it not matter? You don't even know who I am," she stated stubbornly, crossing her arms in front of herself. "I know exactly who you are," I laughed softly. "Who you were, what you did, where you've been, none of that matters to me. All that matters is who you are now," I said as I put a finger under her chin and lifted her gaze to meet mine. "You are Solara von Metz," I said with a small smile, "and you're my world." She smiled at that. For a moment I thought she might even shed a tear, but instead she moved forward and gave me a quick kiss before leaning back away. Followed her movement back and kissed her on the nose. Pulled her into an embrace, which she returned awkwardly at first, but then conceded to the action, resting her head against my chest. "I still want to tell you," she said softly as I ran a hand down her back. "Then I want to hear," I answered as I pulled back and gestured to the bed. "Want to do this lying down?" "Might as well," she answered with a shrug as she unstrapped her weapons and placed them by the bedside. "We should at least be comfortable if we're not sleeping tonight." "Oh, it can't be that long of a story," I answered, following her lead and disarming and removed the majority of my clothing. Against her warmth, I wouldn't need more than my underclothes. "Unless you're actually over 700 years old, too." She smirked at the comment as she worked herself under the covers, wearing blessedly little.
"The story isn't that long, but I think deciding whether or not we stay might take a little longer."
"I just assumed we were leaving in the morning," I answered as I entered on the other side of the bed, the side closest to the door. I held her close as she rested her head on my chest and began drawing shapeless patterns with her fingers.
"Maybe, but we talk first, okay?" she asked absent-mindedly.
"Yes, ma'am," I responded as I leaned down and kissed the top of her head. The wolves operated alone. It had always been this way. Major Aldrich Ferris held the final word on his tasks, and held the final responsibility, be it for victory or defeat. He liked it this way, though, even if he felt the fatigue of loneliness. Sometimes. The sanctuary of Metz was an old place, far older than most would have believed. Once there had been more than a humble village here. Once there had been a castle that operated as a last bastion defense before the river bridge here in the south. Few remembered this now, though. Even those that did remember didn't care. Not anymore. The castle had been built by the Elathians and held by the Elathians for centuries. So many Anaran attacks pushed back, so many dead at the feet of Castle von Metz, on her walls and her courtyards and her catacombs. She fell, eventually, as all things did. The Anaran commander responsible, enraged by the escape of some of the Metz bloodline, had ordered the castle razed to the ground for the many defeats it had represented. Oh, the sins of youth, Aldrich mused at the memory of having given the order so long ago. Aldrich descended the stone stairs beneath the sanctuary slowly, allowing himself a moment of nostalgia at the memories of a lifelong past. He ran his right hand along the rough stone walls as he walked deeper and deeper into the darkness. He needed no light, for nothing had changed since his last descent to the depths below.
His reward for the taking of Castle von Metz and his punishment for the raising of it had been his first transition through the portal below, as its power had waned and ebbed. His survival was to be determined by fate, so it had been, and on that day he became an Elysian. It was power and property, an energy, a magic of sorts that could be harnessed from so many souls having lived and died in a single place. Enough residue over time to create a bridge between the planes, a link back to home, or at least the home of the Elysians. Over the years, the humble little village of Metz, reborn of its namesake, had been gathering power for the portal below its sanctuary. The attack, however, the murder of people, the rape of women, the torture of men, it had poisoned the waters. There was enough power for communication, perhaps to send Elysians home, but not enough to bring forth reinforcements. The reinforcements Aldrich had desired. He emerged into the rocky basin below as his boots splashed into the water that was only a few inches deep. The round shape of the room allowed for 2 layers of circles, one within the other. The outside circle was coated with the shallow clear water that Aldrich traversed now. It was several feet wide, and the circumference could host over 30 people standing shoulder to shoulder. The inner layer had a diameter of nearly 12 feet and was far deeper than anyone could ever know. The water glowed and undulated in random and hypnotizing patterns. The color was that of blood-red stained glass with the light of the full moon shining through. These pools were the most beautiful things Aldrich had ever seen, and at times he would do nothing but stare into their depths, wishing only to drown in their soft light. He looked around the room slowly, observing the play of the light on the stone ceiling and roughly hewn walls. Finally, he allowed his eyes to rest on the only other living soul in the cavern. "Are you ready, my son?" Aldrich asked, his attention still upon the ceiling and not on the man kneeling before the pool. The man, missing the better part of his right arm, nodded his head slowly as he stared into the pool. Aldrich didn't believe he'd make it. If he hadn't the strength of will to live without the arm, then he hadn't the strength of will to survive the transition and become an Elysian. But fate would decide who was wrong and who was right. "I am," he replied, not sounding at all ready. "Then why are we still talking?" Aldrich asked with a fatherly smile down at the boy. He nodded quickly before allowing himself to plunge into the glowing waters. A few minutes passed as Aldrich stared at the ceiling above, watching the lights play off of the rough-hewn rock. Eventually, a voice called out from behind him. He had expected to hear someone, but not her. There was no reason this particular voice should be present at all. "He didn't make it." Lilith's almost slurred tones washed across him. "I didn't expect him to," he answered before turning to see the projection of the woman. She was rendered perfectly by the portal. Nothing was amiss. The color of her dark red, almost black hair, and the cracked black irises that looked as though bloody embers were trying to break through. The sound of her voice, so very inviting, without a hint of distortion. Even her smell, scent of heat and fire with a smoky undertone, like a forest fire burning in the distance. She was a woman of lean structure, with broad shoulders for her gender, but rather diminutive height, especially when standing beside Aldrich's more intimidating form. "I also didn't expect to see you here, Lilith," he growled as he turned away from her again. "Oh, the way you say my name, so much disdain, so much emotion," she breathed as she closed the distance and came around to his front. "Say it again for me, please," she said with a small smile as she reached up to touch his cheek. That was where the illusion ended, however. She had no power to touch him, not as she was now. Aldrich spun around and stalked towards the staircase, ignoring the way her hand passed through his face and his cloak through her body. "I have had more than my fill of your childish and tired games," he called over his shoulder without bothering to look back. "You used to enjoy them so very much," she answered him calmly. He turned to see her resting casually as she picked at something beneath her nail that only she could see. "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things," Aldrich recited in almost a whisper before turning to leave again. "Report, Major," Lilith called, stopping him before he could reach much further. I don't report to you, I report to Lieutenant Colonel Yamin, Aldrich answered coldly. Lieutenant Colonel Yamin is indisposed presently. Lilith laughed softly at what she apparently found to be mildly entertaining. You'll report to me, Major, at least for the time being. Now tell me, why aren't we sending reinforcements through this portal? Well, Major, Aldrich began, being sure to emphasize her similar rank. There were some disciplinary issues. The well is poisoned. The bridge? She asked as she looked back at the water for a brief moment. Will be taken, Aldrich answered the unspoken question. This setback does not rob us of victory, it merely delays it. How long? 2 weeks, then we attack. A day to break the garrison, and we will have a clear line of invasion from there. Disciplinary issues? Lilith mused as she stepped near to him again, holding her hands behind her in a way that mocked how he often lectured. How very unlike you, Alpha. Might we give some suggestions on how to keep the men in line? You may question my methods if I fail to deliver victory. Until then, the wolves are mine to do with as I see fit, he answered as he stopped in front of her, glowering down at her from his height. Now you run along back to your masters, pup. Deliver your report while I execute my commission, he snarled as she held his gaze. He watched as she slowly brought up her right hand and then proceeded to pass it along his cheek, as if either of them could feel the action. Anger looks good on you, Major, she said as she turned away from him and towards the pool, preparing to fall into it and end the connection. Defensiveness and insecurity, however, do not, she finished as she dropped into the eddying liquid. Aldrich's eye merely twitched at the insult before he turned away as the light faded from the pool. Her opinions were unimportant, only results mattered, and he intended to deliver them. You fought for Inara? I asked, the slightest edge of disbelief coloring my tone. For 10 years? I finished as I held her curled against me and facing away on the bed we'd taken as our own. 12, if you count the 2 years as a runner, she answered quietly, still not turning towards me. 16-year-old conscript me wasn't very good at lifting and swinging metal weaponry, and bows require even more strength. Do you think the captain knows? I pondered, almost to myself as I looked at the door. Do you think he cares? She asked in return, causing me to pause for a moment. I guess it wouldn't matter to him who you used to swing a sword for, as long as you swing it for him now, I answered rather drowsily as I pressed my face into her raven black hair and simply took in her presence, from the smoothness of her skin to the warmth of her back to the smell of her hair. I just wanted to get away from this war. She breathed softly, almost too quiet for me to even hear. And you did. For a while, anyway, I began. Now let's get away from it again. Together this time, I finished, closing my eyes and preparing to drift away. I could deal with the realities of her past another time, and if this was what revenge would cost us, I could learn to live without it. No, she said firmly, causing me to shake out of my stupor for a moment as she wriggled around to face me. No? I asked, trying to work the sleep from my eyes. No, she confirmed as she locked my gaze with her own dark eyes in their depths. I was a coward before. With you, I'm stronger than that. This isn't our war, Syl, I replied, confusion coloring the tones of my voice. Tell that to Metz, she answered firmly, and continued before I could get a word in. This is everyone's war. There are just those who know it, and those who are yet to realize it. I left the Inarans because of things exactly like Metz. Someone has to fight them. Since the beginning of history. That's how long he said they've been fighting. It's not going to end now just because we joined the ranks. You're an Inaran deserter. I'm a villager that happens to know how to swing a sword. We can make a difference here, Cade. And we're not going to do that hiding in the middle of the woods, farming and hunting, she replied with enough heat to make me pause for a moment as she broke eye contact. We'd find a nice spot, I answered into the silence. Build a house, raise some kids. We could be happy, I said with a smile. I couldn't be, she finally said as she returned her gaze to my eyes. Not yet, Caden. I have something to offer here, and so do you. Come on, Syl, I replied, rolling my eyes before her hand found my cheek and forced my gaze back to her. I see you, Caden von Metz, she intoned as she came closer, so close that our noses touched. I see the man you are, the man you could become. I see your strength, your mind, your heart. She breathed as she kissed me softly on the lips and pulled away. I see the people you could help, the goodness you could bring, she finished as I took some pause to think over what she'd said. If this was what she needed to be fulfilled, then it was what I needed too. If that's the man you see, then that's the man I'll be, I answered as I returned the kiss. Don't give me all the credit, though. Couldn't do any of that without you. Yes, you could, she said with a soft smile. No, I answered firmly. No, I couldn't. She was quiet then as she buried her face against my chest and I rested my chin on top of her head, feeling her warm breaths against me. Just for a while, Cade, she whispered softly. Just until we make a difference. We'll know when we've done our part, she added as she nuzzled her head to find a more comfortable position. Then you can build me that house. Oh no, then we can build that house, I corrected as I ran a hand down her exposed back. You're helping. Fine, she said with an exasperated sigh. I'll help you build the stupid house, she finished as her voice trailed off. All was silent for a while. There was one more question I had to ask before I could sleep. Syl? I asked softly, as though I didn't already know she wasn't asleep yet. Cade? She answered breathily. The Elysians, I trailed off, trying to figure out how to word my question. It's all true, she answered. The preternatural abilities, the dying, coming back. No, I responded skeptically, but she silenced me by bringing up a lazy hand and resting the index finger right of my lips, though I imagine she had actually been aiming for the middle. I saw it, Caden, she continued. I saw it all. That's why I left. I saw it and the impossible terrified me. She drifted off with a deep breath, and this time I knew she was actually asleep. This wasn't the path I had planned, but I knew I'd follow whatever path she took, clear to the very end. If I got my revenge along the way, all the better.